in the early summer of 1922. The air along Long Island felt soft and still. The heat came gently, not in a rush, and the leaves swayed in slow patterns, as if they were too tired to rustle loudly. The streets in West Egg, where I rented a modest little house, were quiet most days. Even the birds seemed to take their time flying. It had a lawn that grew a bit unevenly, and a porch that creaked gently when I sat on it. It reminded me of a castle from an old book, one with ghosts or secrets. The house seemed too grand for the little road it sat on. At night, it came to life with small, glowing lights. The sun made the windows glow faintly, and their voices sounded hushed, even though we were inside. Daisy welcomed me with a soft, drawn-out hello. She laughed like someone remembering something funny from a long time ago. Tom greeted me with a firm handshake, strong and heavy. His voice always felt like it was meant to cut through a room, whether it needed cutting or not. The moon was low over the bay, and the surface of the water looked like velvet, with small ripples like stitching. One particular light at the end of the dock blinked gently in green, never too bright, just barely catching the eye. Not trying to say anything clearly, just being there. Not the kind of quiet that makes one lonely, but the kind that lets you think. The book I had brought outside lay open in my lap, unread. My thoughts drifted like the sound of water lapping gently against the shore. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then stopped. A moth tapped softly against the porch light. The stars didn't twinkle much. They held their places like small, polite guests in the sky. There was a breeze that day. It moved slowly through the curtains, then across the table, lifting a coaster and letting it drift a few inches before falling back again. It stood very still, not moving. One hand was raised slightly. The other was at its side, and a figure standing in the dark. It looked toward the water, toward the green light. The figure didn't speak, didn't wave, just stood. I thought perhaps he was reaching for something or remembering something, but there was nothing to reach for, only air and distance. The question floated like everything else in that house, weightless and without an answer. I said something vague, and she laughed again, gently, like wind through reeds. Daisy watched it, smiling faintly. I only heard about her in bits. Tom, meanwhile, seemed restless, as if the house could not hold him long. When the phone rang, he stood and left the room quickly, without explanation. Daisy's smile held a moment longer before fading, like a candle slowly giving in to the night. There was a single rocking chair there, and sometimes, on warm evenings, I would sit and listen to the creek back and forth like a slow heartbeat. The smell of grass and distant salt water filled the air. My cousin Daisy lived there with her husband, Tom Buchanan. Their house was white, with tall French windows that opened two long, lazy curtains. Those curtains floated and curled in the summer air like ribbons in water. I could hear the soft plop of a fish jumping now and then in the bay. I was from the Midwest, a place of slow habits and straight roads. Just a name on people's lips, floating in the space between stories and guesses. I came to New York to work, to learn, and maybe to feel something different. But mostly, I came to sit quietly and observe. I was good at that, watching, listening, not interrupting. The house I rented was small and weathered. My house faced the water, and across the bay stood a mansion. It was large and made of stone, with tall windows and white columns. I did not know it then, but that mansion belonged to Gatsby. His name had not yet meant anything to me. On the other side of the bay was East Egg. The homes there were older, more refined, less grand, maybe, but more certain of themselves. When I visited them not long after settling in, the afternoon was still and warm. The room we sat in was large and pale, filled with white furniture and pale rugs. She asked me if I was in love. There was a child, their daughter, though she didn't appear that day. After dinner, I walked back along the road. The gravel crunched quietly beneath my shoes. The trees stood still, holding their breath. The green light blinked again across the way. I stopped and watched it, just watched. There was something about the way it pulsed, not urgent. Near the edge of the lawn by the mansion, I saw a figure. The night was quiet. I sat on my porch again, the chair creaking gently beneath me. The summer had begun in whispers. Nothing shouted, nothing demanded. Just light and breeze. And I, too, waited for what I didn't yet know. But something was there, just ahead, quiet and still, and watching. The days passed gently, as they do when the sun rises and sets without urgency. There were no sudden changes in the weather, no loud events, no pressing matters to hurry the hours. I spent many days in the city, traveling by train, walking through streets lined with stone buildings. Then there were sounds, music, laughter, voices drifting across the night air. Soon, every weekend, the house came alive in full, as if it had been sleeping all week, only to wake when Friday came. It was smooth and slow, filled with horns and low piano notes. Jazz that walked, not ran, the kind of music that fit the night air. Sometimes the songs blended with the sound of clinking glasses or the faint splash of someone dipping a hand in a fountain. The sky was fading from blue to violet, and the first lights in the garden were already glowing. Some danced on the terrace under strings of warm bulbs. Others sat on stone benches beside trimmed hedges. It was a party, yes, but a hushed one, where the quiet was part of the charm. I walked slowly, nodding at a few strangers. Most didn't know who Gatsby was. Some had never seen him, but his name was everywhere, spoken in half-whispers, repeated like a name in a legend. The gravel path to the house was lined with lanterns, and the grass looked darker under the soft light. I passed fountains and trays of drinks. Waiters moved silently, offering glasses filled with golden liquid that smelled faintly of mint and citrus. It was as if the party wasn't tea, just at the house, spilled out and settled over the entire neighborhood. Strings of lights appeared in the trees. Cars with polished chrome pulled into the long gravel driveway. Somewhere, a tray dropped with a faint clink, followed by the soft sweep of someone cleaning it up. Nothing startled, nothing hurried. Everything moved slowly, like a film running at half speed. The stories changed depending on who told them, but no one seemed certain. The air smelled faintly of lilac, perhaps from the bushes along the edge of the path. He stood at the edge of the terrace, alone, looking toward the dock and the light. I didn't follow. I watched. Guests said goodnight and disappeared into cars. Some were driven away in long black automobiles. Others strolled out on foot, their shoes clicking gently on the path. The light stayed on, but the music slowed. The trumpet player packed his case. The lanterns dimmed one by one. People murmured about the grandeur of the house, its chandeliers, its endless staircases. One man said he heard Gatsby had bought it all in a single day, cash in hand. Another said Gatsby was too generous, that he hardly touched the parties himself. Women in long dresses and soft heels stepped out, followed by men in tuxedos or white jackets, smiling quietly. He wore a white jacket with a light blue tie, and his hair was combed back with precision. He introduced himself simply. A few people danced with easy, unhurried steps. The gravel under my shoes felt softer than usual. A breeze moved in from the water, and the scent of the flowers followed me. The air was thick with garden smells and perfume. Lanterns glowed in the trees, flickering like fireflies, and hearing the quiet hush of office halls and the low murmur of typewriters at work. He smiled, but didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted for a moment toward the water, toward that green light that blinked slowly across the bay. He offered me a drink, and we spoke for a while. He nodded often. He listened with interest that didn't press. My job was there, but my attention often drifted. Each evening, when I returned home, West Egg welcomed me in the same way. The same trees lined the streets. The same breeze rolled off the bay, the same soft rustling of leaves and the familiar creaking of the porch under my weight. But one thing had started to shift. The mansion next door, the one across my narrow lawn, had begun to light up more often and more brightly. First, it was just a few windows glowing behind curtains. It was an invitation. Gatsby himself had sent it. No explanation, no request, just a quiet welcome. I was surprised. I had not expected one. I watched from my porch. I never went over at first. I didn't know how. There was no doorbell to ring, no friend to meet. The guests simply arrived. They knew someone who knew someone, or they had heard stories and decided to come. No one ever seemed to be turned away. The music that drifted from Gatsby's house was not fast or overwhelming. One morning, I received a note. It had been delivered by hand, folded once and written in tidy, slanted handwriting. When Saturday came, I walked over just after sunset. The house was full, but not loud. People stood in clusters, speaking softly, laughing gently. They said he had been a war hero, or that he once sailed round the world, or that he was related to royalty. Eventually, near a marble wall draped with ivy, I met a man with a gentle voice and calm smile. "I'm Gatsby," he said. His voice was warm but quiet, as if he didn't want the moment to be too big. I asked him if he enjoyed hosting so many guests. "I throw parties," he said softly, "but not everyone comes for the same reason." The music continued behind us, gentle and rhythmic. The evening moved forward. More guests arrived. Plates were passed. A man played a quiet trumpet near the fountain. A woman laughed into her hand. I saw a group gathered near a buffet table, admiring a silver bowl filled with ice and bottles. As the moon rose, I noticed Gatsby stepping away from the group. Later, as the night deepened, the party began to thin. I walked home quietly. That night, from my porch, I looked again toward the mansion. The windows glowed faintly, and near the water, the green light blinked, steady, soft, waiting. One morning, as the days began to stretch longer and the sun arrived earlier through my window, I received a quiet invitation from Tom Buchanan. It wasn't formal, and it wasn't particularly kind. The smell of coal and iron hung in the air, and the benches along the platform were empty, save for a man reading a newspaper and a woman holding a paper bag of groceries. Tom stood near the tracks, wearing a straw hat and a suit that looked like it had never been crumpled. He simply told me to meet him at the train station. He had something to show me, he said. Something on the way to the city. The station was quiet that morning. Ash covered everything: fields, houses, tracks. It sat in thick layers, quiet and still. Smoke rose from hidden chimneys, disappearing into clouds that looked like they belonged to no weather at all. We boarded the train and sat across from each other. He didn't speak much at first. The train rocked gently, the world outside moving past in slow blurs, trees, fields, wooden fences. After a moment, a woman appeared. The grass disappeared, the trees grew thinner. And then, almost all at once, we entered a place that seemed untouched by color. She disappeared upstairs and came back a few minutes later, wearing a different dress. It had large buttons and smelled faintly of perfume. Myrtle spoke more now. She laughed louder. She became someone else entirely. It was on the top floor, full of mismatched furniture and pictures that looked like they had been bought all at once from a dusty store. They poured drinks that smelled of gin and citrus, and they spoke with slow amusement about people I didn't know. The room filled with perfume and smoke. The voices grew louder, though no one said anything important. The couch was wide and soft. The windows faced a brick wall. She spoke about dogs, about clothes, about wanting a better life. Tom watched her, not unkindly, but not softly either. And behind it, the green light blinked, steady as always, across the bay. Once, when she said Daisy's name too loudly, he struck her. She called Tom by name, and Tom didn't correct her. Her clothes were bright in contrast to the gray surroundings. She was Myrtle Wilson, George's wife. She did not smile at George. She did not look at him at all. A man stood beside a dusty car, wiping his hands with a rag that never seemed to clean anything. His name was George Wilson. He looked tired in a permanent way, with eyes that seemed used to looking down. He smiled at us politely, though it didn't quite reach his face. Even in the city, it lingered in shadows and on the edges of shoes. The hallway was dark and smelled of dust and varnish. I took the elevator down slowly and walked back through the streets alone. A few houses, small and leaning. Laundry-on lines, unmoving in the heavy air. As we moved further from West Egg and closer to the edge of the city, the landscape began to change. This was the Valley of Ashes. Someone turned on the radio. A dance began. I sat by the window and looked out at the brick wall. The air here was different. It felt dusty even inside the train. The sky turned a flat shade of gray. There was a billboard, old and peeling, that rose above the ashes. It had once been a bright advertisement, but the paint had faded. Only the eyes remained clear-hued, blue and watching. We stepped down into the ash, our shoes stirring up pale dust that settled again almost instantly. They belonged to a forgotten oculist named Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. His eyes hung above the valley, unblinking. The train slowed, then stopped near a row of dull buildings. Tom stood and nodded for me to follow. He led me to a small garage. The sign above it was crooked. Tom spoke with him briefly, something about a car. Then he turned and called softly toward the staircase at the back of the garage. She was tall, with a curving figure and dark hair. Tom said we would be going into the city. Myrtle nodded. Her expression changed less ash, more spark. We took a different train, and soon we were surrounded again by tall buildings and clean streets. We went to a small apartment that Tom kept. People began to arrive. Friends of Myrtle, a sister named Catherine, a man with round glasses and flushed cheeks. Myrtle laughed in sharp bursts. The room grew quiet, then louder again, as if it wanted to forget what had just happened. The light outside had faded. The ash had followed us somehow. When the evening grew late and the guests began to doze in armchairs, I left. No one noticed. The city lights flickered like sleepy stars. Somewhere, far away, the valley waited in its gray silence. The next few days passed slowly, as if time were a guest that had overstayed its welcome and now moved carefully, not to disturb the quiet of the room. The weather was gentle. A breeze floated through the open windows and stirred the papers on my desk. In the distance, the water shimmered faintly, soft waves folding into one another without urgency. The sound of teaspoons against porcelain clinked gently, like wind chimes in a sleepy garden. We sat by the window where the sunlight moved lazily across the tablecloth. Jordan talked slowly. It was during one of these days that I saw Jordan Baker again. She came to my house unannounced, with the same casual grace she always carried. Only the soft ticking of the clock on the wall behind her and the faint hiss of steam from the kitchen. Just casually, so Gatsby could come by and plant, of course, and see her again. Her voice was low and unbothered. She leaned against the doorframe and asked if I'd like to go for tea. He wore a suit that fit as though it had been designed for a quieter version of him. The world passed by in slow frame trees with sleepy shadows. Road signs bent from years of wind. Buildings that looked older than their paint. He smiled a little too much, and he asked how I was a little too often. I nodded, and we walked together into town. When we drove back, Gatsby asked if I'd help with Daisy, with the tea. The waiter spoke softly. A man named Wolfsheim joined us, introduced as a friend of Gatsby's. He wore a strange tie and spoke with a thick accent. He told stories of old times, about people long gone. And I thought about what it must be like to wish for something across a bay. He said he was from the Midwest, like me. He said he inherited wealth. He mentioned war medals, travels, a past filled with distant lights and grand rooms. As though a long-held breath had finally been let go. I listened. I nodded. I didn't press. The tea room we found was quiet and almost empty. It was in the middle of stirring her tea that she mentioned Gatsby. "He wants to talk to you," she said, without looking up. I blinked. To me, a man in a suit stood there. He said Mr. Gatsby would be pleased if I'd join him for a ride the next day. His tone was polite, like a waiter announcing a course. I agreed. She nodded. Yes, he's got something to ask. But he's nervous. He thought maybe I could help. Her tone was even. There was no rush. I looked at her and asked if it was really so simple. She shrugged. For him, it's everything. But yes, it's just tea. We walked back slowly. The sidewalks were warm from the afternoon sun. Leaves rustled underfoot. I thought about the green light. I thought about Gatsby watching it every night. Later that evening, a knock came at my door. The next day, Gatsby arrived in a cream-colored car that gleamed like new china. We drove through the countryside and into the city. Gatsby talked. He told me his story, though it came out like a rehearsed speech. We reached the city and had lunch at a quiet restaurant tucked between tall buildings. The afternoon passed in shadow. The city seemed to breathe slower than usual, its heart quieter than before. I told him yes. He smiled, the smallest smile. Not one of triumph, more like relief. The morning of the tea was gray, soft and still. The sky hung low, its color like wet newspaper, and the air smelled of damp earth and early flowers. He asked if everything was still going as planned. I told him it was. Sent by Gatsby, he moved silently through my small yard, clipping weeds, brushing off leaves, making everything neat. Then came another man with a tray of fine china. Then a third man carrying a large bouquet of white and pale pink flowers, roses, mostly mixed with small wildflowers and baby's breath. There was a pause, and then he said he would come by with flowers. I said that would be fine. I rose early, even though I didn't sleep well the night before. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, resting on the flowers, the china, the clock. Then I called for Gatsby. I moved quietly through my house, making coffee, setting the table, and watching the wind stir the edge of the garden. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the rain, still tapping gently against the window. Gatsby walked toward her, slowly. His hands were at his sides. Daisy opened her mouth, as if to say something, but nothing came. Finally, he said her name. The table was already set. The kettle hissed softly. I poured the tea and placed the cups before them. They sat stiffly at first. Their words were clipped, polite. Though the water was hidden by fog, he told her it was out there, and so was her house. She walked to the window too, and for a moment they stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder, looking into the soft gray. The kind of rain that doesn't soak you quickly, but slowly works its way into everything. Gatsby pointed out a painting, a piano, the view from the window. He pulled them from drawers and tossed them gently onto the bed. They fluttered like sails and settled in soft folds. A small tear rolled down her cheek, but she did not brush it away. Everything was neat. Everything was prepared. The rooms were filled with soft light and the faint scent of roses. It was the sort of rain that seemed too quiet, even the birds softening their songs into whispers in the trees. Gatsby had called very early. His voice, always calm, held a nervous edge this time. Not awkward, not strained, just still. As though all the years between them had curled into a single moment. I told him no, it wasn't too late, but Daisy would be here soon. Daisy laughed once, gently, the way someone laughs at a memory they hadn't visited in years. Gatsby's face changed. The worry in his brow smoothed, and he began to speak more freely. He nodded and walked once around the room, then again. Then he stood by the window, staring at the rain as it began to fall. Daisy nodded, responding with similar softness. Their shoulders relaxed. She sipped her tea, holding the cup with both hands, and glanced at Gatsby in a way that held more than politeness. There was something distant and warm in it. Just after 10 o'clock, a gardener arrived. By the time Gatsby himself arrived, the house had never looked so put together. He wore a white suit and a silver tie. His shoes were brown and polished. Just a few minutes away, he said. There was something he wanted to show her. I agreed, and we stepped out into the rain, which was beginning to lighten. He looked as though he had stepped out of a photograph, but his hands moved too often, and his eyes kept checking the clock. He asked if it was too late to cancel. It wasn't a heavy rain, just a soft, steady one. It fell on the leaves and rooftops and tapped lightly at the glass. She wore a dress the color of cream, and her hair was curled slightly at the ends. Her umbrella was closed, and small raindrops dotted her shoulders. She looked at me and smiled faintly, unsure. When the bell rang, Gatsby stepped quickly into the next room. I opened the door, and there stood Daisy. I led her inside. He stepped out quietly. Daisy, she nodded. Hello, Jay. I felt like a guest in my own home, so I offered them tea and stepped away. But slowly, like the rain soaking into the garden, their voices softened. He pointed out small things, the clock on the shelf, the china patterns, the rain on the windows. He stood, walked to the window, and pointed out toward the bay. After some time, Gatsby asked if they could take a short drive. His house was waiting, lit from within as if it expected her. The walk through the rooms was quiet. Daisy said little. She touched the edge of a curtain, the top of a table, the spine of a book. In his bedroom, he showed her his shirt stacks and stacks of fine fabric in all colors. Daisy picked one up. She held it for a long time. "They're beautiful," she said. Her voice caught. Gatsby watched her. He didn't smile. He just watched. A soft breeze moved through the open window. The curtains danced a little. The rain had stopped. They stood in silence. And in that room, filled with fabric and silence, long hoped for seemed to arrive softly, quietly, as if it had always been on its way. In the days that followed the tea, everything seemed to glow faintly around Gatsby. The air itself appeared lighter, as though some invisible weight had been lifted from the sky above his house. He stood very still, often just watching the bay. But now there was a softness to the way he did it. He only spoke about the past of how they met, of the light in her voice, of the warmth in her laugh. It wasn't the past as it had been, I sensed. It was the past as he wished it had been. But he spoke of it gently, as if the truth might be too sharp in the telling. He spoke of plans, grand ones. He wanted to fix things, but in his voice was a quiet echo of worry. He feared perfection might not be enough to rearrange rooms, to have a certain type of music playing whenever she visited. But he only smiled. "You can't repeat the past?" he asked, almost to himself. "Of course you can." They didn't need to say much. It seemed as though the very presence of each other was enough. On some evenings, they would sit by the fountain, their hands touching lightly on the bench, not moving, not speaking. The silence between them felt full, not empty. He talked about the color of the curtains, the height of the hedges, the light fixtures in the hall. Her dress flowed softly down to her ankles, and the light from the window fell just behind her, wrapping her in a golden outline. Gatsby stood below, looking up at her like one might look at the first morning of spring. Sometimes I imagined him writing letters he would never send. Sometimes I thought he simply sat there, dreaming with his eyes open. They met at the landing and simply stood there for a time, the hush of the house folding around them. It was the kind of dream that comes late in sleep, soft and drifting, where nothing happens quickly and nothing needs to. The silhouette of his figure at the desk seemed to be part of the house now, as fixed as the wallpaper, as steady as the ticking clock. The halls echoed less. The parties had ceased entirely, and in their place was a quieter kind of gathering. No more music through the trees, no more laughter spilling down the steps, just the soft sound of feet on carpet, the gentle click of teacups. Everything matters now, he said, every detail, and decided to hold it. The flowers bloomed slowly. The days stretched like shadows, and the world, for a while, seemed to belong to quiet hopes. Less of a longing, more of a quiet remembering. He showed me a hidden corner where lilacs grew, where he said Daisy would sit once the garden was in full bloom. She loved this, he said, his hand brushing the top of the flowers. The petals shivered slightly under his touch, as though they too were waiting. A piece that wasn't there before had now crept gently into a silhouette, as if some part of him had finally exhaled. His garden looked greener, his windows brighter. Even the fountains, quietly bubbling in the sun, seemed more eager in their dance. Her voice became part of the quiet, blending into the corners of rooms, into the soft lamp glow, into the hush that now surrounded everything Gatsby touched. Every evening, I noticed him at the end of his dock. He began to visit often. Sometimes he came to my house just to ask if Daisy had said anything. One afternoon, we walked together around his property. The sun was soft on the lawns. Inside, he had arranged for someone to play the piano in the evenings. The man was quiet, and his fingers moved slowly across the keys. The music filled the hall like mist, curling gently around the walls and slipping through the open windows into the quiet air outside. Gatsby would sit in a chair, eyes half closed, while Daisy walked the hallways, brushing her fingertips along the bookshelves, occasionally pulling out a title to read its spine. She never spoke loudly in the house. One day, as I passed through the gate to his house, Gatsby met me with a certain energy in his step. He had waited so long for her, he said, and now that she was near again, he wanted everything to be perfect. I told him softly that the past was a gentle thing, better admired than relived. He said it with such confidence, as though the world had only to shift slightly to make it true. He began to see Daisy more often. Sometimes they would disappear for hours, walking through the gardens or sitting by the water in silence. At night, I would look from my porch and see the light in Gatsby's study still burning. There was a peace in those days, a softness, as if the entire town had taken a long breath. Even the servants at Gatsby's house moved more gently now. I remember watching Daisy one afternoon as she stood at the top of the stairs, one hand resting lightly on the railing. She descended slowly. Neither of them spoke. It was a dream, I thought, but not one of fever or urgency. The summer drifted on, quiet and heavy with warmth. Days moved slowly, as though each one was stretching out its arms before dissolving into dusk. The skies remained mostly clear, with long afternoons filled with the soft hum of insects and the distant rustle of tree, branches swaying in the breeze. It was the kind of weather that made conversation slow and footsteps quieter. Gatsby and Daisy saw each other often now, not in the grand, sweeping gestures of novels, but in the small and quiet ways that speak of comfort. He would send a car to bring her over, and they would sit together in the shaded parts of the garden. Sometimes they simply listened to the wind or the creak of the swing on the back porch. They didn't seem to need much else. A house, perhaps farther from the city, a quiet place, maybe a child or two. Daisy would listen. She wouldn't always answer, but she listened. Gatsby, who had once filled his nights with orchestras and guests, now seemed perfectly content to sit beside Daisy and count the falling petals from the trees. Gatsby had built his dream, and now he was living inside it. He spoke little in those moments, just enough to make her smile, never too much. The leaves were still green, but they had a fullness to them now, a heaviness that meant they had seen too many suns. The light had begun to soften earlier in the day. The air in the evenings was cooler. He didn't speak his name with anger, just a kind of polite distance, like someone describing a piece of furniture that no longer fit the room. Daisy shifted when he said it, just slightly. Each time, he would point out some small detail he had overlooked before. We sat in silence for a long while, not out of awkwardness, but because there simply wasn't much to say. The kind of silence that comes when people know each other too well to fill every moment with words. From my porch, I could see the light in Gatsby's study still burning. Not a place to live, but a place to wait. A soft, slow space suspended between memory and hope. A pale glow, steady and constant. It reminded me of a lighthouse knot, one that warned of danger, but one that hoped to be seen. But I think maybe she'll still come back. Then he turned and walked slowly back toward the house. A painting's frame, a reflection in the hallway mirror, the curve of a staircase, slices of cold meat, fresh bread, pickled vegetables, a quiet meal in a bright room. He looked down the driveway toward the empty road, then back at me. The breeze slipped through the curtains, bringing in the scent of the lawn and distant water. Daisy asked about my plans. Gatsby asked if I had seen the paper, but none of it mattered. Not really. She listened with patient interest, her eyes drifting from place to place, her fingers resting lightly on the backs of chairs, the spines of books. The mansion had changed. It was quieter now. The servants moved with softer steps, as though responding to the gentle atmosphere Gatsby had curated. The great rooms that once echoed with the voices of strangers were hushed. Daisy always wore pale dresses in those moments-like fabrics that caught the breeze and whispered as she walked. It drifted out the open windows like a breeze, curling around the pillars, mingling with the scent of damp earth and distant roses. The sound followed me down the drive, fading into the warm air. Gatsby, always in crisp shirts and perfectly tied ties, would offer her his arm with quiet pride. Even the fountains seemed to flow more slowly, their streams falling with a kind of careful rhythm. In the evenings, they would sometimes stroll down to the water. I watched them once from across the bay, just outlines in the dimming light, walking slowly along the edge of the lawn. The water shimmered a dull gold, and their shadows melted into the earth with each step. On other days, Gatsby would show her through the house again. He spoke of the future sometimes, softly, a future that included her, always. There were no grand declarations in those days, no parties, no fireworks, just long, slow afternoons and cool, open nights. But even dreams have edges. One evening, he mentioned Tom. Briefly, he didn't press. He smiled instead and turned her attention back to the roses blooming near the veranda. But I saw the flicker. Just for a moment, summer was moving forward. Slowly, but inevitably. One afternoon, Gatsby invited me for lunch. Daisy was there. She poured tea. We ate slowly. That afternoon, as I left, Gatsby walked me to the car. She'd never leave him, he said, not bitterly. Just as a simple truth. He didn't say more. I started the engine, and he nodded. Inside, the piano played again. A soft waltz, barely audible from where I stood. That night, I couldn't sleep right away. I sat outside for a while. In that quiet moment, I realized Gatsby's house had become a kind of dream itself. The morning began slowly, with a faint haze resting over the lawns and rooftops. The sun had not yet burned through the clouds completely, so the world remained hushed and cool. A pale light filtered in through my windows, brushing gently across the floorboards and casting long, blurry shadows. I had just finished a quiet breakfast, some toast, slightly overdone, and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarmly. The phone rang. Gatsby's voice, soft and measured, came through the line. Daisy stood near the porch, fidgeting with the brim of her hat. He hadn't been invited, not really, but he had arrived anyway, his presence as loud and unmoving as ever. He wore a stiff expression and carried himself with a weight that made the air feel thicker. Her dress was the color of faded ivory, light and soft, barely moving in the quiet wind. It pressed down on the buildings, making the air shimmer faintly and the sidewalks feel sticky underfoot. We decided to stop at a hotel. It was a tall building with stone walls that seemed to hold the warmth from every summer that had passed before. The billboard with Dr. T.J. Eckelberg still watched from above, its faded eyes steady and unreadable. He began to speak of Gatsby, first gently, then with increasing sharpness. He questioned Gatsby's past, his wealth, his status, as though a thread had loosened somewhere deep inside him. The words filled the room like smoke, curling into corners and drifting through the silence. A fan turned slowly in the corner, doing little to ease the warmth. Daisy commented on the shape of the ceiling. Jordan asked about the color of the carpet. The sound of the car, the hum of the tires, and then the sharp cry tires skidding, a thud too loud. Then silence. Shadows grew long across the ground. We drove slowly, tired from the sun, from the day, from everything that hadn't been said. Gatsby leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Daisy covered her mouth. No one said a word. We sat there for a long time, all five of us, surrounded by stillness and thick, warm air. The day had turned, and the light outside had taken on the golden color of late afternoon. We decided to drive back, each of us silent as we stepped into the hot air. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the furniture and the distant hum of the city far below. Her voice, when it came, was soft and tired. The words hung in the air like something delicate and too honest. Below it, George Wilson stood in the doorway of his garage, his shoulders slumped, a hand raised briefly in half-hearted greeting. Tom drove Gatsby's car. Gatsby and Daisy sat in the back, barely speaking. I sat beside Jordan in the front seat of Tom's blue coupe. The road stretching out ahead like a ribbon of heat and silence. No one said much. The trees leaned again, this time as if listening. He asked if I would join him and Daisy for a drive into the city. I agreed, though the invitation felt slightly heavier than usual, as though carried by something unspoken. By the time I arrived, Gatsby was already outside. He wore a pale suit and waited beside the car, one hand tucked neatly into his pocket. Tom was there too. We decided awkwardly to go together. The journey to the city was long and slow. The wheels hummed steadily beneath us, and the landscape rolled past in soft tones of green and gray. Trees leaned slightly toward the road, their branches swaying with the breeze, brushing each other like tired dancers. The occasional car passed by, its sound rising, then fading like a whisper crossing a quiet room. We crossed the valley of ashes again. The dust in the air seemed thicker than before, clinging to the windows and softening the view. Tom didn't slow down. When we reached the city, the heat had gathered in full. We found a suite near the top. The room was dim and quiet, the blinds drawn halfway to keep the sunlight out. Conversation moved slowly. Words came out in half thoughts and faded off before they reached their ends. Tom, on the other hand, had grown restless. Daisy said very little. Gatsby's face didn't change. He looked at her with the same steady expression he always wore, but behind his eyes, something softened. We didn't stay long after that. That evening, the return trip felt longer. The silence between us stretched, and the roads seemed wider, emptier. By the time we neared the Valley of Ashes once more, the light had deepened. The moment was brief, too brief to grasp at first. Myrtle Wilson had run into the road. There was a blur, a breath held in stillness. Then we were past it. Tom's hands gripped the wheel tighter. We did not stop. The night continued on, thick with quiet, the stars above dusting the dark sky like forgotten ash. The trees lining the property stood still, their leaves only rustling when the lightest breeze dared to pass through. But Gatsby no longer reached for it. He simply stood, his figure outlined by the soft moonlight behind him, his hands resting at his sides. The dream that had filled his life was now near him, yet it seemed to drift farther away the longer he stood there. A single lamp burned in the corner, casting a puddle of golden light onto the floor. He sat by the window for a time, watching the rain that began to fall gently against the panes. He reached for it, then let his hand rest beside it. He lit a cigarette, then left it burning in the ashtray. Outside, the rain thickened into a soft downpour, pattering on the roof like a lullaby. Still, the phone did not ring. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and wet leaves. The garden looked washed clean. Dew clung to the petals. The gravel path was darkened by the rain. From Gatsby's dock, the bay looked endless, calm and open, like a mirror waiting for the sky to settle. The water had been too cold for weeks now, but he insisted. For a moment, I thought he was only resting, but the silence was too deep. He walked alone to the pool. The sky overhead was heavy with clouds. The sun hadn't broken through. The world felt paused. The green light glowed, faint but steady, across the water. It flickered once, just slightly, as though blinking slowly. I had dreamt of something I couldn't remember, only a feeling of dread. I wanted to check on him. I wanted to see if he had heard from Daisy. They would ask questions, but none of it would matter. Not really. I stayed beside him in silence. we didn't speak. It made a small ripple which spread outward, slow and steady, like time letting go. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been whispered in glances, in late-night thoughts, in the quiet spaces between words. Instead, he lay still, listening to the rain and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. His thoughts were quiet now, not racing, just slow, steady, tired. He had crossed an invisible line that most of us only ever watch from afar, the boundary between dreaming and reality. And now he stood alone with the weight of it all. After a long while, Gatsby turned back toward the house. The grass muffled his steps. The door creaked softly as he entered. She said she'd call. He murmured to no one in particular. He looked down at the telephone on the side table. It sat there silently, as it had all day, its dial untouched. The butler brought Gatsby some coffee, which went cold before he drank it. He went to bed, late well past midnight, but he didn't sleep. At dawn, Gatsby rose and dressed. He told the butler he'd like to go for a swim. I arrived at the house shortly after. I'd been restless, uneasy. The butler looked pale. He told me Gatsby had gone to the pool. Something in his voice made me hurry. The water was calm, and Gatsby floated near the edge. His arms gently spread, his eyes closed. A single leaf drifted down and landed on the surface of the water. Later, the authorities would come. They would speak in low tones. The dream that Gatsby carried had ended. It hadn't burst or shattered. It had simply faded like mist under morning sun. The green light still glowed across the water, but now no one reached for it. The morning after Gatsby's death passed in a kind of gray silence. The sky remained overcast, as if even the sun didn't feel it was the right time to shine. The world outside moved quietly. Cars hummed slowly down the road. Birds sang only in soft fragments. Inside the house, everything seemed untouched, yet nothing felt the same. I wandered the halls with a quiet step. The rooms, which once echoed with laughter and music, now held only the muffled sounds of stillness. The staff moved carefully. No one spoke unless they had to. There was a hush that seemed to press gently against the walls. I tried to call Daisy. The line rang and rang. No one picked up. I tried again. Still, nothing. And in the end, she had vanished into the comfort of her own. Tom and Daisy had disappeared. He held his hat in both hands as he stepped through the doorway. His eyes looked around the house in quiet wonder. I called people from Gatsby's past, those who had come to his parties, drunk his wine, danced in his garden. Few responded. Most didn't answer. The ones who did made excuses. They were busy. They were traveling. They didn't know him well. Packed up and gone. No forwarding address. No goodbye. Gatsby had filled his life with dreams for her, built his world around her. I was left to arrange the funeral. It was a slow, strange process. The undertaker was polite, gentle with his words, as though speaking too loudly might wake the house itself. One man did come. A gentle rain fell not heavy, just enough to dampen the grass and blur the view. The minister stood beneath a black umbrella. The few of us gathered said little. There was no music, no speeches, just the sound of the rain tapping softly against the wooden coffin. Who had written lists of goals, saved clippings of yachts, and drawn maps of imaginary worlds where he was someone grand? He stood beside me in the rain, looking down at the grave. Someone important. It had always seemed a symbol of something larger, hope, longing, the distance between dreams and what's real, about the cold winters and the hard land, about how his son had always wanted to escape that life. He used to stare at the stars and say they were windows to something bigger, he said. The books, neatly shelved, smelled faintly of old paper and dust. I ran my fingers along their spines. Some were worn. Some had never been opened, but all of them had been placed there with care, like bricks in a foundation meant to hold up a dream. I guess I thought he'd grow out of it, but tonight it felt small, not less meaningful, just quieter. Henry Gatsby's father. The minister said a few soft words, but they passed over like a whisper on wind. He arrived quietly, a thin man with silver hair and hands worn from work. The path was muddy and quiet, the sound of our shoes sticking to the ground with each slow step. The grass glistened with droplets, and every bush and branch seemed to bow just slightly, as if mourning in their own way. This was his home, he asked, more to himself than to me. It was neat, ambitious. Wake at 6. Practice elocution. Study electricity. No wasting time. I nodded. He made it far, he said softly, almost proudly. We sat together that evening, and he told me stories of Gatsby, of James Gatz, the boy who had always dreamed of more. He showed me one of the schedules his son had written as a teenager. He believed in progress, his father said. He believed you could change your life by working hard. I listened. I nodded. And I felt the quiet weight of everything Gatsby had tried to become. The day of the funeral came. The sky stayed gray. The man with the owl-eyed glasses came. I remembered him from one of Gatsby's parties. He had a grand house, the man said quietly. But no one came. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The earth was soft as they lowered the casket. The sound of soil falling into the grave was faint, like footsteps fading into the distance. After the service, Gatsby's father and I walked slowly back to the house. That evening, we sat near the parlor window, looking out at the bay. The sky had begun to darken. The green light blinked again from across the water. Mr. Gatz told me about the small house where Gatsby had been born. We sat there for a long time. The light from the lamp on the table cast long shadows across the floor. The clock ticked steadily in the hall. Later, when the house had gone still again, I walked through Gatsby's library. I paused at the doorway and looked back one more time. The silence of the room wrapped itself around me, and then I left. The days that followed the funeral passed slowly. The house remained quiet, the garden growing wilder by the hour. Down the narrow paths near the beach, beside the rows of hedges that Gatsby had once trimmed so carefully. The lawn no longer looked perfect. The fountains didn't run. The laughter that had once filled the air had faded into memory. The silence was no longer heavy, but soft, like a blanket that settles once the wind has passed. Those who stayed packed boxes in hushed voices. Rooms once bursting with brightness and music were now dim and full of echoes. Light filtered through half-drawn curtains, catching dust in gentle shafts across the floor. I found myself walking alone more often. Inside, the servants moved with quiet efficiency. Many had already left. Each morning, I would pour myself a cup of coffee and sit on the back porch. I looked out toward the bay, past the lawn that once held lanterns and long tables, past the shoreline where guests once arrived by boat. I watched him go, his suitcase small, his coat too thin for the journey. He turned once before stepping into the cab and looked at the house again. I imagined her far away now, wrapped in the quiet of Tom's world, a place without consequence, where the past could be forgotten and the future ignored. He had created Gatsby the way a child might build a castle in the sand carefully, hopefully believing it would stand forever. Her voice had its usual cool calm, but there was distance now. I passed through the empty ballroom, the kitchen now dark and quiet, the guest rooms left open and untouched. The shadows from the window stretched long across the floor as the day drifted into dusk. I paused at Gatsby's room, where the shirts still hung neatly in rows, untouched by wind or wear. I ran my fingers along the edges of books he had never read. Books chosen to impress, but also to fill something, an idea, maybe, of being someone complete. She spoke as if from across a quiet lake, far and still. Whatever had been between us had drifted away. The crickets would sing, and the soft croak of frogs carried from somewhere in the reeds. Just walked the city, sat in and watched people pass. All of them chasing something, or forgetting something, or maybe doing both. The sky was clear again. Traffic passed with a gentle rhythm, and all around, summer began to settle into its end. The moonlight would skim over the surface of the water, and I would think of that green light blinking softly across the bay, and filled it with beautiful things. The past would come walking through the door, unchanged. I thought often about Gatsby, about James Gatz, really. The boy who had invented himself with paper schedules and wild ambition. And for a little while, it did. He believed in the idea that one could repeat the past. That if you built your world carefully enough, lit it with the right kind of glow, the rugs were rolled up, the windows stood bare. I touched the edges of the doorway as I passed, remembering laughter and music and long nights full of glowing light. But it never does, not really. The house stood silent, unchanged in form, but hollow in spirit. I imagined Gatsby there for a moment, standing tall, eyes fixed toward the water, hands in his pockets. I tried once more to reach Daisy. Still no answer. I thought about Jordan, too. We had spoken briefly after the funeral. Gatsby's father left a few days later. He did all right, didn't he? He asked. I nodded. Yes, I said. He did. And then he was gone. Alone, I wandered the house once more. There was a kind of peace there now. The storm of his dreams had ended, leaving behind only stillness. I wandered back downstairs and stopped in the library. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. I sat there in the leather chair beside the cold fireplace, staring at the patterns on the rug. Some evenings, I would sit on the porch long after the sun had gone. Not a beacon anymore, not a promise, just a memory. On my final morning, I walked through the house one last time. At the front steps, I turned to look back, and then I left. The cab ride back to the city was long and slow. I didn't speak much for days. It was quiet and strangely peaceful. That was how it ended, really, not with noise, not with fanfare, just with time and the slow falling away of one man's dream. And always, always, that soft blink of green across the bay. The city seemed louder after the stillness of Gatsby's home. Horns honked in the distance. Shoes clicked against pavement. Trains rumbled along their tracks. But here in the east, things shimmered with a strange kind of light. It was beautiful, but hollow. Everything sparkled, but felt just out of reach, like Gatsby's dream. I walked through streets lined with familiar buildings, past storefronts glowing with amber lamps and evening shadows. My thoughts moved slowly, like a tide pulling away from shore. I was thinking about the difference between east and west. Back home, everything had seemed simple. Quiet streets, early mornings, steady rhythms of small-town life. I sat on benches where old men fed pigeons and read papers. Its brilliance came at a cost. Beneath the polished surfaces, there was something empty, a yearning that never settled. I understood now why Gatsby had dreamed so fiercely, why he had reached out night after night toward a light that could never reach back. The world moved slowly here, and I let it. But it didn't belong to me. These little pieces of the city, though beautiful in their own right, reminded me of what I missed. The comfort of familiar rhythms, the honesty of plain surroundings. Gatsby, most of all, his face would return to me in the dim lamplight, still hopeful even in memory. He had lived with such intention. It had been flawed, yes, but it had been true in its longing. A cup still rested in the sink. I had barely lived there in recent months. About the slow streets and quiet porches. About mornings that began with birdsong and ended with stars that didn't blink with promises. I leaned on the railing, looking out over the rooftops. The breeze was gentle. It was a simple melody, no words, no crowd. Gatsby's world had pulled me away, and now I had returned like someone waking from a long, strange dream. The city was a place of reinvention, but I was tired of that. I didn't want to be someone else. I just wanted to be. I remembered the parties, the laughter, the clink of glasses. All of it had seemed so grand, so full of possibility. They moved on, untouched, leaving behind the broken pieces for someone else to gather. I missed the open spaces, the slower pace, the sound of crickets instead of car horns. I missed the feeling of belonging, not to a dream, but to a place that didn't need to sparkle to be real. With each folded shirt, with each box sealed, I felt a little lighter, a little closer to something honest. They had their wealth to cushion them, their silence to protect them. And I knew then that I would never belong to that world. And now it felt like smoke, something you saw clearly until you tried to hold it. Our connection had never been rooted. It was more like the feeling of passing a stranger in a hallway, a glance, a moment, then gone. The apartment I returned to was small and still. My books sat untouched on the shelves. I sat near the window one evening, watching the lamps come on across the buildings. Lights flickered in patterns steady, predictable, but none of them glowed like Gatsby's green light. None of them seemed to call out with hope. I thought again of Daisy and Tom. Their world was one of escape. Even Jordan, cool and distant, had faded from view. I took long walks through Central Park, its paths winding like thoughts. I watched leaves drift on still water. The east had shown me something I had not expected. It wasn't foolish, it was human. And so, as the days passed, I thought more often about home. The east was dazzling. I began to take notice of small things, again birds, lining up along a telephone wire. The scent of roasted nuts from a cart near the corner. The way light fell through tall buildings at noon. There were times in the quiet of the night when I would sit on my apartment floor and think about the people who had come and gone. The West, where I was from, seemed to call to me, now not with grandeur, but with a whisper. Even the newspapers felt different here. Stories about scandals and stock tickers, about people who rose quickly and vanished just as fast. So I wrote letters to people back home. I told them I might return soon. I packed slowly, not rushing the decision. When I stepped out onto the fire escape one last evening, the sky was soft with dusk, and in that moment, I knew I was ready. Not to forget what had happened, but to leave it gently behind. The morning I left the city, the sky was washed in soft gray light. It was neither bright nor stormy, just quiet. The kind of sky that asked for nothing. I stood at the edge of the train platform, my bag at my feet, and watched the gentle flow of people moving in and out of the station. The station smelled faintly of coffee and old stone. Footsteps echoed off the walls. A slow shuffle here, a faster stride there. People clutched briefcases, suitcases, newspapers. Some leaned into their mourning with purpose. Others moved as though still caught in sleep. The train arrived with a low hum, its metal sides reflecting the dull silver of the day. I climbed aboard and found a window seat, far from anyone else, a calming pulse. I listened as it carried me farther from the east, each mile a small breath of release. The sound of steel on steel was gentle now, not sharp. Then stretches of trees that blurred into a soft green sweep. The occasional bird flew by, cutting through the sky with unhurried grace. The train rocked him gently like a lullaby. His breathing was soft and even, a steady rhythm that matched the wheels beneath us. Farmhouses appeared now and then, small, square, steady. Smoke rising in curls from chimneys. Fences marking boundaries that no one crossed. The page was like the journey itself unwritten, but slowly revealing itself with each passing mile. The world inside the train moved gently, like time had slowed to a quiet rhythm. Even the conductor's footsteps were hushed, his voice low when he asked for tickets. The world had moved on, and the dream, once so bright, had faded like the light at dusk. A gentle whistle blew through the wind, and I closed my eyes just for a moment. I would open my eyes now and then, check the sky, and close them again. The lull of the train was like a mother's hand on your back, reassuring, repeating, familiar. Outside, fields turned into woods, then opened again into soft hills. It was a quiet kind of beautiful not the sharp, showy beauty of the city, but the long, slow beauty that grows over time. The sound of my father's voice calling from the kitchen. Things that had once felt ordinary now returned with a kind of soft clarity. The small things, the gentle things, the steady heartbeat of home. Whatever was there, it would be quieter, slower, easier to breathe. Just a hum, a vibration that seemed to rock the thoughts in my head into slow motion. The cushion beneath me was worn and familiar. I leaned my forehead against the glass and waited. Of the silk shirts and polished shoes and endless hopes, a rhythm that doesn't have to dazzle to be comforting. There's comfort in knowing what time the sun sets when the mail comes, and how the floor feels cool beneath bare feet in the early morning. I thought of him standing alone on a lawn, looking out at the bay, waiting for something that never truly arrived, as if each turn of the wheel beneath the train was winding me back, not just across distance, but across time. I remembered how the trees looked outside my childhood window, how the floorboards creaked in the hallway, how quiet the nights were, broken only by the rustle of wind or the chirp of crickets. The world moves the way it always has, slowly, quietly, without concern for longing. His dream had glowed like a star for so long, and now it had quietly gone out. As the train pulled away, the city slipped by in soft blurs. Rows of buildings, rusted rooftops, billboards faded by sun and time. I watched them pass, not with longing, but with a kind of distant affection. It had been a part of my life, bright, fleeting moment, but it was not mine to keep. The rhythm of the tracks beneath the car was soft and steady. I thought again of Gatsby, of the parties and the garden lights. He had made himself into someone new. But even that couldn't save him from the silence that followed. We all want something, and sometimes we believe that if we want it enough, the world will bend for us. But it rarely does. Out the window, the landscape changed. Tall buildings gave way to smaller ones, then fields. The clouds above moved slowly. In the seat across from me, an older man had fallen asleep, his hat tipped over his eyes. A newspaper rested gently on his chest. Children whispered somewhere behind me. A mother hushed them, her voice tender and low. I opened my notebook, but didn't write. I simply looked at the blank page, the way the light touched it, the possibilities it held. In some ways, returning home felt like a small undoing. I remembered the way the streets had looked when I left, the trees, the porch light that was always left on. There is a peace in the familiar. The train rolled on. Sleep came slowly, not deep, just enough to drift in and out. I didn't know exactly what I would find when I returned. whether the town had changed, whether the people had changed. But I didn't worry, and all around me, the world moved on. The train slowed as it approached the familiar town. The brakes gave a soft sigh, and the buildings outside the window shifted from long stretches of land into quiet neighborhoods. The station came into view, a small brick structure with a single bench outside and a worn sign that creaked when the wind touched it. I gathered my bag and stepped off the train. The platform was empty. The air smelled of earth and distant rain, the kind of scent that seeps into the ground and stays. It was early afternoon, but the light was gentle, muted by thin clouds drifting slowly across the sky. The breeze rustled the trees beyond the tracks. Leaves danced lazily across the road. Somewhere, a screen door opened and closed, the soft clap of wood echoing briefly. The town wasn't asleep, was just slow, measured, comfortable in its stillness. There was no fanfare, no one waiting, just the station, the trees, and the sound of the engine fading into the distance. The swing still hung from its chain, rocking gently in the wind. The curtains thin and gently waving in the breeze from an open window. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, its rhythm comforting. The steps creaked as I climbed them. The porch ground gently beneath my feet. Each space held memories, not loud or vivid, but soft and steady. Tiny dents from dropped forks, faded circles where glasses had once sat. The refrigerator hummed softly. Outside, a bird chirped once and then went quiet, a laugh echoing from years before. The scratch of a record playing in another room. The creak of the rocking chair in the corner. Even the silence was familiar, of how far he had come, of what he had hoped for, and how gently it had all disappeared. Here it was soft, comforting, a blanket tucked around memory. His dream had been bright and loud, but it had ended here, in this kind of silence, this kind of peace. I stood at the door for a moment, hand resting on the frame, letting the quiet settle around me. I stood for a moment at the edge of the platform, not in a hurry to move. On the shelf sat a few books I hadn't thought about in years. The walls, once covered with posters, were now bare, but the scent of paper, wood, and the faint trace of old cologne brought everything back. Maybe they did. Maybe it didn't matter. There was no rush, no expectation, just the calm of the moment. I walked down the road, my footsteps quiet on the pavement. The house remembered me, and I remembered it. The houses I passed looked much the same, painted in shades of white, pale green and yellow. Gardens, some tidy, some wild, lined the front yards. A bicycle lay in the grass. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The leaves rustled softly, whispering old songs I remembered from childhood. The sidewalk was cracked in places, sprouting little tufts of green. The wind had picked up slightly cool and soft. The sky was a pale violet, streaked with gentle clouds. Somewhere nearby, the hum of crickets began. Porch lights flickered on, one by one, like stars returning to a familiar sky. Mailboxes stood like sentinels at the edge of driveways, some freshly painted, others leaning with age. Curtains stirred behind windows, revealing only brief glimpses of lives being lived quietly. And there, at the edge of the lawn, stood the house. Everything was still, as though the town had been holding its breath and was now slowly beginning to exhale. The path to my family's house curved gently, lined with trees that arched toward each other overhead. The fence at the front of our old house was chipped in places, but still stood. The mailbox leaned slightly. It looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe I had just grown. The porch was faded and dappled with shadow. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood and something baked long ago. The furniture sat just as it had always been, chairs soft with age. I placed my bag on the floor and walked from room to room. In the kitchen, the table still had its familiar marks. I wandered into my old bedroom. The bed was made, the blanket folded neatly at the foot. The hours passed slowly. The light in the house changing with the sun. I did not speak. I did not need to. As evening came, I stepped outside and sat on the porch. A neighbor passed by with a slow wave. I returned it silently, unsure if they remembered me. It was all so quiet, and yet it felt full. I looked out at the trees, the road, the fading light, and thought once more of Gatsby. In the city, the silence had felt heavy, like absence. And here, in this quiet place, I let that thought rest. The next morning, light spilled through the curtains in quiet beams. It was gentle, not insistent. The house stirred with the subtle sounds of a new day floorboards shifting with warmth. Birds rustling in the hedges outside, and the wind brushing lightly against the windows. The kettle sang on the stove in a voice I remembered, well sharp at first, then round and fading. I made a cup of tea, warm and mild, and sat by the window. I rose without hurry, my steps soft against the familiar floor. The town, just beyond the trees, began to wake. A child's laughter drifted across the yard. A door opened and shut somewhere down the street. Life moved on, as it always did, slowly and without ceremony. My eyes lingered instead on the view, the tall grass swaying with ease, the soft curve of the road, the way shadows changed shape with every passing minute. I thought of the green light blinking quietly in the dark. The breeze had picked up again, lifting the edge of the curtain, cooling the room. The light had shifted once more. It was about what we see in others when we're looking for ourselves, about how far we're willing to reach for something that may never reach back. And in that moment, I felt quietly whole. Not as a symbol now, but as something real. A light on the end of a dock. A point in the night that never asked to be chased. Time was gentle here. It moved like a slow tide, washing over everything, softening the edges. A car passed, its tires whispering along the road. A sprinkler ticked rhythmically in a nearby garden, past the bakery with its warm, yeasty scent, past the barber shop where an old man sat outside, half asleep in the sun, past the schoolyard where swings creaked and laughter rang through the air like music from another time, in a peaceful way, like a page in a very large book. Not the beginning, not the end, just a quiet sentence in the middle. A sparrow hopped along the railing, then flew off in a flurry of wings. I stood there for a while, looking out at the land. It stretched far and wide, uninterrupted. The sky above it was pale blue and still. It reminded me that things continued quietly, peacefully. The world didn't always need fixing or chasing. Sometimes it simply needed noticing. The air was filled with the scent of grass and lilacs. I listened to the breeze through the trees, the occasional creak of the chair, the soft ticking of my watch. I opened a book, but didn't read. And the West, my home, now offered its softness in return. Not perfect, not free from disappointment, but kind, familiar, steady. Perhaps not the past returned. Perhaps only someone to sit beside him in the stillness. Someone to see him, not the legend, but the man. My thoughts wandered back to Gatsby, back to that house on the bay and the echo of music that had once spilled from its windows. Others let them go, watching them drift upward like smoke into the morning air. Some dreams are meant to guide us, others to show us who we are when we let them go. I had spent so much time thinking about what Gatsby had wanted. But now, in the quiet, I wondered instead what he had needed. We all carry dreams, fragile and flickering. Some hold them tightly, trying to keep them alive. The East, with all its brightness and glamour, had shown me its sharp edges. I sat a little longer, sipping the last of my tea. The story, I thought, was not really about Gatsby, not entirely. And yet, we reach, because somewhere in the reaching, we remember what it feels like to hope. I wandered out to the porch and sat in the wooden rocker, watching the leaves dance in the wind. Down the road, someone was mowing a lawn. The low hum rose and fell. Later that morning, I walked to the edge of town. I came to the edge of the fields where the grass grew taller and the path turned to dust. And I felt small, but not in a frightening way. The day moved forward, slowly, softly, as it always did, and I let it.